Welcome, everybody, to this edition of Noisy Reality on Saturday, June 11th, 2022. You just have heard the opening theme of Victory at Sea, and it's ironic that we are having a discussion of Paul Kennedy's new book, Victory at Sea, at the time of the 70th anniversary of that iconic television series that aired in 1952. Obviously, we're not going to be discussing the Second World War and the naval history the way they did. That is, essentially having music and film making its point. But it is interesting to start off our discussion today on the ramifications of Paul Kennedy's new book, Victory at Sea, with keeping that in mind. That is, of course, a TV series that was shown around the world in 40 countries that obviously influenced our outlook towards the naval war of World War II, and a series that essentially was interrelated to the Cold War, was created to counter the Navy's fear about the Air Force dominating the budget. All sorts of interesting issues come in which affect today how to think about naval power in the world we live in. But we're going to have the great pleasure today to have Professor Kennedy talk about his new book. To help us introduce the book and to be my co-host today, we have the great pleasure of having Aaron Glasserman. Aaron Glasserman is a PhD from Columbia University, was educated at Princeton, is now a postdoc at Harvard, is going to go down to Princeton this year, Aaron, if I understand, and then go back to Harvard again. So let me turn the show over to Aaron.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to be here, and my honor to introduce our speaker and the featured author, Professor Paul Kennedy, who is going to be speaking on his new book, recently out with Yale University Press, Victory at Sea, Naval Power and the Transformation of the Global World Order in World War II. As many of you already know, I'm sure, Professor Kennedy is a professor of history at Yale University, and where he directs the International Security Studies program, and is also involved in the famous Grand Strategy program there. And he's written widely on many topics ranging from British naval history and military history through great power relations and grand strategy, such that even people from other fields like my own China studies are very familiar with some of his works, although it was a pleasure for me to sit down with this very thorough and but also beautifully written study of naval war in World War II. So, as Jim mentioned, I come from China studies, and so with that in mind, I see my role here today as maybe offering a sort of getting us started on a more general picture with some more general questions. And then I'm sure that we will, given the amount of expertise in this room between Paul and all of you, we'll probably spiral in on one, if not more, sort of very detailed issues as the conversation goes on. But I have a couple of questions that I like to sort of pitch initially, maybe one by one, as a historian and someone with a more general interest in your work, Paul. So one of the things that I appreciated in the work is you invoke the French historian Fernand Braudel and his approach to writing history. This sort of comes from the Annales school, of course, and he sort of analyzes historical change by looking at sort of three main temporalities. Sort of geographic time, a largest scale, looking at how climate and environmental history evolve and shape developments. A more social and cultural and economic historical level at a sort of second tier. And then finally, events and individuals and people with names. And obviously, this is not the first time that you've written about World War II or naval history. So as a way of getting us started, I'm wondering if you could speak to what you're trying to accomplish by telling this history using, or sort of with a gesturing toward, Braudel methodology, and what you think it brings to the study of naval history in general, and the study of World War II, and how it can change sort of the conventional wisdom on those topics.
All right, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this. I'm really thrilled to be here. So I was first doing my own study of history many years ago when the wonderful translation of Braudel's classic work, Mediterranean and Mediterranean Policy in the Age of Philip II, came out. That was followed by many other books of Braudel. What struck us modern historians in some envy at what Braudel was doing in the 16th and 17th century was the way he suggested that there were, as you just mentioned, possibly three levels of causation and activity or non-activity going on in our approach to the past in the study of history. The bottom level, the profound history, as he called it, l'histoire profonde, was that sort of unchanging geographic and atmospheric and weather-driven reality, the reality of the extent of the Pacific Ocean, the reality of the storms of the North Atlantic. That went on age after age after age, virtually unchanging. Then there was a middle level of change, slowish or perhaps faster, induced by new changes in trade, in invention, in technology. And they began to affect, when the occasion arose, the top level Braudel called the history of events. And if you haven't read Braudel, then the history of events would be something like the Battle of Lepanto or the Spanish Armada. So if we pulled this forward to looking at the Second World War at sea, could we also adopt something, I mean, without being too strict and too narrow, could we adopt something like a Braudelian, at least an understanding of it? What were the larger geographic, unending, unchanging forces which occurred in both the Atlantic and in the Pacific in the Second World War? What were the impact of newer technologies and newer inventions and things like that? And then how did these begin to show themselves and affect the history of events? It was no coincidence, I'm sure Braudel would have said, no coincidence that from June 1943 onwards, new large aircraft carriers keep coming into Pearl Harbor to join Nimitz's fleet at the rate of about one every month. A full carrier and a light fleet carrier and another full carrier. Where do they come from? They come from a change in the productive balances at the middle level. So this is not exactly strict naval history of battles and admirals and the epic story, but there's something profound underneath it, which at least I thought I would give a stab at, even as I'm trying to write a book which is about Ian Marshall's paintings.
You got on mute, Aaron.
Sorry, thank you. Another general theme that I'm sure we'll return to over the course of the discussion concerns the development of technology, new technologies and their impact on the course of developments in war, and also, as you emphasize, the sort of the backstory of technology, so to speak. And so, it's not just the introduction of Hellcats, but the whole sort of supply chain that gets the bauxite into aluminum and the production, all the way from South America up to the U.S. and then finally into the Pacific theater. I'm wondering then, linking this to Brauddel's conception of three levels of causation and time, as we look ahead into sort of our current century and the rapid pace of technological change, how do you see do you see a potential for these sort of events level developments to be more impactful as technology can be sort of more disruptive, both kind of in the conventional theaters of war, but also with developments in cyber, and also I would add economic sanctions, for example, other ways in which technology can be deployed in ways that are relevant to the use of military force. Do you see how do you see the role of technology changing, and more fundamentally the relationship between technological change and the progress of war and other levels of historical change more generally?
Thank you for that. So I divide my answer to your remarks into two ways. I love it for my fellow historians to offer their views of what we try to do when we try to do more than simply with the introduction of the long-range Mustang, or with the coming of this, or with the improvement in the torpedo effectiveness of the U.S. Navy. What are we doing when we say with the introduction, with the coming, with the arrival of? And don't some of us at least sometimes have to go and say, well, where did that come from? Where did the long-range Mustang come from? So this is a challenge to historians, because we have a basic task of telling the story, but we have to go behind the story. Now, moving on to the second part of what you say, gosh, this is something which I tease my contemporary strategic studies colleagues about, and technology colleagues about. Are we not right now, again, I'd love for responses to this, are we not right now at one of those times in history when a cluster of new technologies may be bringing asymmetric weapons of war to have a capacity to undermine the existing prevailing power structures of navies and the large weapon systems they have? Wasn't it ironic, Aaron, it was just about the time that Jackie Fisher is producing the Dreadnought battleship, all big gun battleship, and saying this is the thing which will dominate sea power for the future, that those creepy things like submarines and torpedoes and naval mines and later on small aircraft were coming out. If you said, this is the thing, say the carrier task forces right now, which dominates sea power, might not some of our colleagues come along and say, wait a minute, we are in the age of drones, of hypersonic missile systems, of a whole lot of things being developed with great activity by your Chinese friends, by the way, which are deliberately intending to reduce the advantage of the prevailing big weapon system. And what do we think about that?
Thank you. And finally, before I pass things on over to Jim, I can't help but ask a China-related question. I'm sure you get a lot of them these days. I think many of us are impressed by the parallels and connections that can be made between what's going, or the story of industrial capacity and economic development and its relationship to the projection of military strength in World War II and developments that we're seeing nowadays. This question has two parts. First of all, I'd like to very open-endedly ask, of the connections that you've either been challenged with, presented with as you sort of introduce this book to the field, are there any that stand out to you as especially significant and maybe underappreciated by the general public? I think many people nowadays are familiar with, for example, the importance of, to continue this issue of the supply chain of critical technologies, of semiconductors, for example, right? And will we be telling a similar story that you tell about the Hellcats, and that in 50 years or 100 years, when we're writing the history of the next conflict, about Taiwan and lithium mines in different parts of the world? So are there sort of underappreciated, in contrast to that, maybe underappreciated parallels with China that you would like to talk about? And second, and relatedly, I'm curious if you've had any engagement with Chinese scholars or officials even on this book or your previous books, and how have they been received, and what has struck you as interesting about that, if at all?
Thank you. I think I'll start by going to your last question first. I would say, somewhat laughing at myself, that when my literary agent sends me from time to time, 6 monthly accounts of sales of books, in most markets, they're kind of desultory and small. But I have to say that the largest checks which come in these days and for sales of Paul Kennedy's books in foreign language translations are, you may say, unsurprisingly, the China ones, and they are for the Chinese translation of The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. But the second one, which quite gets me scratching my head, because the Chinese are so purposeful in what they buy and what they read. The second is my British Naval Mastery book of 40 years ago. This is the story of the rising British naval power, and then the underlying reasons for that, as well as the fighting capacities of the British Navy. So why are the Chinese buying in such large numbers British naval mastery? Because they're trying to study lessons from the past. When Rise and Fall of the Great Powers came out, the Chinese, in their noble way of not wanting to give you too much in your own, at that time, royalties, had a 6 or 8 part television series called Rise and Fall of Great Nations, which was a rather similar thing. You start off with Philip II of Spain, and you go all the way through past Imperial Germany to the United States. But the lesson is, who is coming next? So it's with that secular Chinese intentionality behind it, I think we could move on to the first part of your question, which is, are there, without being too emphatic about strict parallels, are there some things going on today which our study of history and supply chains and new technologies and new sources of material for weapon systems, we should be paying attention to now? And you zeroed in really quickly and impressively on this thing about microprocessors and microchips and their reliance upon particular metals and particular forms of manufacturing them, which, alas, are almost all on the other side of the Pacific, in Taiwan and in South Korea, where the largest of the chip producers are. And I've just been in correspondence with Professor Chris Miller at Tufts about this, because he's writing a book on the issue of the production of microchips and the vitality of finding how to get the accurate forms of production of this so valuable sort of instrument of war as well as instrument of peace. For the later historian of 30 or 40 years' time, they might point to this as being one of the great deficits of our strategic industrial production, is our reliance on this critical element from overseas.
Okay. Let me pick it up. Let me get into the issue of how you came to write this book in the first place. And I wanted to share with us some of the images of Ian Marshall, because as I understand it, that was a major motivator for you to write this to begin with. And I'm going to start with actually this image, which I found. This is the last image in your book.
Yes.
This, of course, is a U.S. nuclear-powered carrier, I believe, sailing under the San Francisco Bridge.
Yes, through the mists.
And just tell us who Ian Marshall was and how that got you to get into this subject matter.
So Ian Marshall was a soft-spoken Lowland Scots architect who pursued his professional career, first of all, in Rhodesia and South Africa. Came later, that is in the 1950s, I'm guessing, came later to the United States, married Jean, still alive, and developed his second passion, which was the painting of maritime scenes. What we're looking at are what we're going to see are some of the paintings which I capture from his large archive of some published, some recognized, some completely new, of his paintings of warships in historic settings. But he had done a first book on armored clads. He had done a second book on ocean liners going to India, the passages to India. He'd done a wonderful book on long range British Airways and Pan Am types of commercial aircraft flying across the Pacific and into down East Africa in the 1920s and 1930s, flying boats. And this set of photographs, this set of original paintings here was just part of his great oeuvre. I got to know him like one or two other professional historians of naval affairs knew him. Oh, I guess about 15 years ago. I used to ask if he might do a new painting of a warship scene, which my father remembered on the River Tyne during the Second World War, which he obliged me to do. And I was thrilled when he told me he was doing a whole set of new paintings, as you've just heard a few minutes ago, to be put there on display, at a permanent display in the museum part of the USS Intrepid when it returned from its big refurbishment. So when Ian learned that that was not going to happen and was rather crestfallen about it, I proposed, although I had other things on my mind, I proposed that he tried to put some of these paintings together called Fighting Warships at Sea, and I would write an introduction to it. He went ahead with more and more paintings, and I got rather sucked into sort of writing a basic text for the 6 years of the war at sea. So I became a partner of his, at least at long distance. He would sometimes come down from his studio in New Hampshire, bringing fresh paintings, leave them off at my house in New Haven, where I could only goggle at them. I really like this one of the Ark Royal coming into the Grand Harbor of Malta. Malta was one of his favorite backdrop scenes. You can see the sort of influence of Turner there, as well as anything else. And so I was really staggered when one Christmas time a few years ago, his daughter called to say that Ian had passed away of a serious stroke in his kitchen and was no more. The question was whether one would walk away from this to go and work on my other projects or turn around and try to give some time to putting it all together, maybe with more of a historian and economic and technology historians look at the way the Second World War at sea unfolded. So Ian was the cause and the driver for my first getting into this book. This painting here, if you can stop a minute, is of a scene that my father told me he remembered of the great fighting destroyer HMS Kelly under Lord Louis Mountbatten had been beaten up by E-boats off the German-Danish shores and was almost sinking, was towed back in. They tossed a lot of anti-aircraft guns off, most of the crew off. It's being towed back in to the original yard, Jarrow yard, where it had been constructed just a few years earlier. The little pinpoint figures on the shoreline are the individual shipyard workers looking in awe at the return of the Kelly. This is an amazing collection of paintings.
All right. Well, very good. Now, one of the aspects of your book is a discussion of the influence of these two people, and I'm just going to highlight them for a second. Alfred Thayer Mahan and Sir Julian Stafford Corbett. And I know that recently there has been a conference organized, I believe, down at Annapolis. I think it was postponed. It was supposed to be in the UK, and then I think it came off. But I'm just curious as to your interpretation of the effects of the thinking of Mahan and Corbett on the Second World War.
I guess there's two ways of thinking about this question and two levels of answer. One is, for many of you listening, you know what we're talking about here. Mahan was his classic work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and some of his later works, was this emphasis on using history to show that the key to getting decisive domination of the seas had to be seen in the creation of and the deployment of the great battle fleet. And anything else, like the French approaches of commerce raiding, would just not hack it. So Mahan, with the emphasis upon dominance of the sea through the large battle fleet navy, and along a little later comes this other historian, a Brit rather than an American, also sort of connected with admiralties because he wrote much of the official history of the Navy of the First World War. But Corbett, because of his historical studies of, say, sea warfare in the age of the War of the Austrian Succession, and in particular of the 7 Years' War in the middle of the 18th century, coming to the conclusion that control of the long-range lines of communication for trade were the most decisive aspect of understanding sea power as it was successfully deployed. Because sea power, the point about sea power was it was looking after the carriage of so much of the supplies of war, men, and materials, which would then affect the greater outcome of the land war itself. So we have two views of sea power, one emphasizing the centrality of the battle fleet and the decisive battle, and the other saying, no, so long as you get your trade carried unchallenged or unimpeded by attacks by French commerce raiders or by German U-boats later on, then this was the essence of it all. To most sensible people listening in, you would say, well, isn't it true that you need both Mahan and Corbett? That unless you get control of the sea in the Western Pacific by large-scale fleet encounters, by the aircraft carrier groups by that stage, or get control of the sea, sometimes by encounters between the Royal Navy and the Italian Navy, you aren't going to get secure lines of communication. But the historians, tend to go for one of these schools of thought or the other. I felt that looking at the overall war at sea and victory at sea, there was a wonderful story of some epic clashes, decisive clashes. What would have happened if the Bismarck had been successful and then come out later with the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau? But then the story of the unfolding day by day carriage of ships and goods by like 15 convoys at a time across the North Atlantic is the other Corbettian view of thinking about sea power.
All right, and that gets me to my last question before we open it up. Obviously, everybody here who are on this call here have been extensive readers of the performance of all the navies in World War II, the British, the Americans, the Germans, the Japanese, etc. And one of the things that gets lost in I would say, xenophobic approaches to World War II is one will emphasize completely the American naval experience and de-emphasize the Royal Navy's experience. And I wanted to pose a question to you straight up. What did you learn that was sort of new to you in examining the Royal Navy's performance in the Second World War in this new history you've done?
I don't think I was particularly new in my emphasis here. Max Hastings had just been writing quite considerably, including his wonderful new book on the pedestal operation about the performance of a Royal Navy in the Second World War, and others have done the same. But you put your finger on a point. There is a whole cluster of British naval historians who will emphasize the special role of a Royal Navy at sea, whether it be in the North Atlantic convoy battles against the U-boats or in the Mediterranean campaigns. And others of American naval historians will be focused very, very much on the Pacific War and pay not too much attention to either the Battle of the Atlantic, where the Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy were prime in the contestation against the U-boats, or the war in the Mediterranean. And that's fair enough. But there's a time when we have to step back and say, wait a minute, this great war at sea, which I'm pleased to say, Simmons and one or two other recent historians have managed to capture. The Great War at Sea is a great war in the Pacific. It's a very, very great 6-year war in the Atlantic. And it is an astonishing great war at sea for at least 3 years in the Mediterranean. And it's good of us to look at the 3 different campaigns. Pop in, if you want, the Arctic convoys as well. That's when we're going to draw some overall conclusion about the role of sea power in the Second World War and how sea power gave us the outcome of the war, which we are so familiar with.
Okay, great. Let me just bring in John Prados for a minute. John, just unmute and ask a comment or question. Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Okay. So following up on some of this discussion, Dr. Kennedy, I saw a kind of a competition in your manuscript between the Mahanian and the Corbettian ideas. What I didn't see, and you end with this extensive discussion of sort of the ship types and the performance of different ship types through the war and how they came out of the war. By the way, I very much enjoyed your point about the submarines, even though they were defeated, having had the opportunity to be decisive, where some of the other vessel types weren't. But anyway, I didn't see a conclusion coming out of there whether Mahanian principles were superior or Corbettian ones were. What would you say to that?
So first of all, I'm just truly delighted that you came in on this podcast discussion. Thank you so much. I would have said that anyone looking at this big story of a Battle of the Atlantic would have, given the edge to it being a Corbettian, a classic Corbettian struggle, even though the incursions of some German heavy surface ships from time to time tried to contest the oceans. They really were surface raiders in a large sense. In the Pacific, between ourselves, I can well understand how the naval writers and the navalist, if you like, apologists, after the Second World War and into the Cold War, wanted to say that the principles of Mahan was well to the fore and well to be seen in the unfolding of the war in the Pacific, because this itself would justify the Royal Navy's, the US Navy's claims for a large share of the defense budget in the 1940s and 1950s, and that was heavy surface vessels to the fore. But there's nothing wrong with that. I think that the war in the Pacific was overwhelmingly one in which you can say Mahanian principles of control and command of the sea are the ones we should be looking for. There were, as you well know, no Japanese attacks upon the long-range trade lines of communication between the American West Coast and Australia. It wasn't until fairly late in the game that the US Navy, when it had its submarine torpedo element of which was so disappointing at first, when it was improved upon and restored, that it could then start attacking Japanese lines of trade and communication, especially oil trade flows. So I think it's well justified to point to the Pacific Wars being one of occasional great clashes, some of which we're well familiar with in the Battle of the Philippine Sea and in the great battles of Leyte Gulf, and say, there is Mahan in action. But I have to say that when you go to the Battle of the Atlantic, you kind of flip it over, wouldn't you say? And you see the protection of the long-range trade routes as being critical to the grand strategy of each side. Thank you for that, though. I'm much pleased for your intervention.
Well, thank you. So then I take it you would argue that both Mahan and Corbett come out of World War II as, I won't say unaffected, but I would say the competition between their ideas continues.
Yes, and so we also have to say that the end of the Second World War, as I mentioned at the very close of my book, the end of the Second World War sees the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with the whole question about anybody's theories of sea power being of any pertinence at all. It's not surprising that the US Navy, less so the Royal Navy, had to scramble for strategical justifications of its service in the air in an era where it looked as if the US Air Force was going to make claim to everything. But looking more, with a bit more balance, and a few years after 1945, I would say, yes, one could point the defenders of a Mahanian way of looking at sea power could say, yes, this was clearly manifest in the Second World War, especially by the carrier fleets in the Pacific. And the defenders of Corbett could say, look, if it wasn't for the protection of those long-range sea communications, you wouldn't have had D-Day. You wouldn't have had the strategic bombing campaign out of Britain, because you wouldn't have got the supplies and the oil tankers and everything else over to the island fortress. So I'm happy with the assumption that both of those interpretations of sea power see great manifestation in the battles of the Second World War.
Okay, so let me then take you up on a point that you made a little bit earlier in today's conversation about current developments being perhaps the time that challenges the whole previous era. You can really draw a line, in a sense, between the German development of guided weapons, the HS-293, for example, against the Italian battleships at the end of the Italian Naval War, straight up to the recent destruction of the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet by a Ukrainian cruise missile, as illustrating the increasing vulnerability of large combatant vessels of any sort, and thus posing a direct challenge to Mahanian ideas, and at the same time, the vulnerability of large combatant ships, suddenly challenging the idea that Corbettian protection of sea lanes can be achieved by surface fleets. So this might add ammunition to your sense that we're on the cusp of some new development here.
So, I mean, what a great point, and thank you for bringing it up. Supposing the increased sophistication and speed and destructive power of these new surface-to-surface or air-to-surface ship missilery becomes so much of a threat that not only are the large surface warships, as you say, vulnerable to these kind of strikes from the air or sophisticated weapons that the Russians might be inventing, which are strikes from the air, which then become torpedoes before in the last stage of the attack. But supposing that means that anything which goes across the oceans, anything which is on the surface, a large container ship going into Liverpool, a oil tanker coming out of the Persian Gulf, a grain carrier, let alone an ore carrier coming across the Indian Ocean. All of these could be vulnerable to these newer forms of very high-speed missile weaponry. And what do the traditional navies and the naval planners do about that? I think that we are indeed on the cusp, at least of, we have to grapple with that potentiality. It seems to me, and I'd like any of our naval, US naval experts to come in here, but the capacities of, say, an Aegis type cruiser, which was once boasted, could handle about 50 oncoming missiles, might well be overwhelmed if it's not 50 oncoming missiles, but it's 150 oncoming missiles. Some of our novelists, I think, got ahead of that. If you go back to read Red Storm Rising, you begin to say that, wow, the destruction of aircraft carriers in the North Atlantic is quite a possibility. If I don't want to do too much of a plug to my friend Jim Stavropoulos, but if you go back to his book on 2034 and the unfolding scene is narrated there, then at least Navy planners and designers have to think, what sort of world are we going to be in a naval contestation of 10 years' time? I think it's really big question.
Yeah. Anyway, John, let other people come in at this point.
Okay.
Because as I say, Paul, we could have you on here for hours, given how interesting all of us are reacting. And just raise your hands. Aaron has the right to kibitz, as do I. But I will try to refrain my kibitzing. But do raise your hands, and so you know how to do that. Down on the reaction button, I will hit the button, call you up, and just raise your hands to ask questions and comments. And obviously, we all know each other pretty well. I'm as verbose as the next person here, so try to keep it under restraint. Anyway, anybody have any comments or questions? Aaron, do you want to make a little kibitz comment before we get into this? You have to unmute, Aaron. Yeah.
I'm learning a lot from the questions, actually. So why don't we let it all kibitz as necessary.
Right. Okay. So I'm looking at stunned silence here. Otherwise, I'm going to start.
No, I see several. I see Gary.
No, we've got Gary and Alex and Michael.
All right.
And Brandon.
Brandon. Okay.
So Gary's first.
Go on, Gary. Unmute.
Oh, I get to be first. That's great. Well, I would argue that the unfolding of the Pacific War from the United States point of view, at least in the first years, it basically ignored not only the, Mahan and Corbett, but even Clausewitz. In the latter case, I would say Basically, there was this sort of unfolding of this planning that had gone on for decades prior to the War Plan Orange, which didn't really envision this sort of political situation at the time, nor the desired end state, which was at some point, the best you can make it out, that I can make it out, would be the four policemen concept of Roosevelt. And in that case, it seems to me the war versus Japan should have emphasized, China and reopening the Burma Road or whatever, instead of maintaining, supply routes to Australia and New Zealand, which, as you just mentioned, the Japanese never really seriously threatened anyway. With respect to Mahan, I suppose if there was a Mahan for Dummies somewhere in the first chapter, you would have the statement, "Don't divide the fleet." Yet the U.S. Navy came into the war with 7 aircraft carriers, fleet carriers, and only at one time, with one sole exception, up until June of 1944, they never had more than 2 in action against the enemy at the same time, and that one exception being Battle of Midway. And how did that come about? How did that turn out? That turned out pretty well. So they violated Mahan grievously as well. Then, with respect to Corbett, I'll just point out that in 1940, Roosevelt had, mentioned to someone, a colleague, I believe it might have been a letter to his wife, that, if we cut off the oil to Japan, they're going to make war on us. And then in the following year, we did cut off the oil to Japan. They did make war on us, and then made a beeline for the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Thus basically telling us, where their vulnerability was. And as the war did unfold, we did find that the submarine campaign, sort of a side, which was sort of an afterthought, did have a devastating impact on Japan's ability to protect sea power, with the investment of just a fraction of what went into building this massive fleet of aircraft carriers and all that involved. So I just feel like, I'm reminded of the WAG that says, the only thing we learn for history is we don't learn anything from history. We have a similar situation. We're talking about China today. Well, what is their major vulnerability? They import all of their energy, 80% of their energy, and 80% of that comes through the Persian Gulf. Why are we talking about, crashing across the Pacific Ocean with these great fleets that are subject to, area denial missiles and that sort of thing? I would say if we were going to learn from World War II, that would be one, a place to start. So I just like your reaction to that.
Your closing remarks remind me of conversations I've sometimes had with Royal Navy submariners, but they're also people who, have served in U.S. submarines in the past 15 or 20 years. When you ask them closely, they will say, there's only 2 types of ships that go around, and one is surface ships, and one is submarines, and everything above the surface we regard as easy targets. And when I try to talk with U.S. Navy officers who are not submariners, I get the feeling that they are dodging this. I mean, there's something about the capacities of, not just in the Second World War, but particularly the capacity of our subs nowadays, which might be so powerful and so hidden away, it's difficult to handle them at all, which of course might make you say, if you want to keep this conversation going, isn't it really alarming the extent to which the Chinese are now pouring resources into submarines, not just diesel submarines and traditional submarines, but much more sophisticated ones? What are they learning from history? China couldn't be a great part of a 4 policemen, I would argue, in 1941 to 43 onwards, because it was in the middle of this colossal civil war between factions there, and because the Japanese army had about 1.1 million soldiers trying to tear China apart, and trying to get supplies to the China over the hump. Of just flying the aircraft fuel to allow the aircraft to carry anything meant that if you were going to get to China, you had to fight your way across the Pacific, over the Philippines, and why not just swing northwards, as members of Nimitz's fleet said, and go straight for Japan via Iwo Jima and Okinawa. So I think that the war turns out to be not that Clausewitzian war. What happens when the greater part of your battle fleet is knocked out? It may be fortunate. I'm winging back around to your remark about where are the carriers in December 1941. Isn't it fortunate that we didn't have 7 aircraft carriers alongside Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December the 7th? Isn't it fortunate enough that the 2 or 3 U.S. carriers were at sea in December 1941 and other ones were on the Atlantic coast or getting refitted on the Pacific coast? There was some advantage to not concentrating your warships in such an obvious target tempting way. Let me stop there because I know you've got you said some wonderful things, but we could take it between us for the next hour and a half now if we wanted to. Thank you though for great points.
Thanks.
Okay, Alex is next.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. A lot of historians don't like to do counterfactuals, but you clearly do. So I wanted to ask you about 2, I think, of the interesting counterfactuals you pose. One of which is, well, if the Germans had developed their guided bombs to the point where they could have, say, challenged the Normandy fleet coming in on D-Day and blown it out of the water essentially with those bombs. The other one is you suggest a counterfactual of, well, if the Japanese could have landed essentially like at Aden and other points on the Red Sea, what that would have done to the Allied position in the Indian Ocean in 42, when the Kido Butai was going, attacked as far west as Sri Lanka and, Tricomanli. Although to there, I always thought that logistics would be way too far for them. But maybe you found differently. So again, I'd appreciate a comment on those 2 counterfactuals. Yeah.
Wow, thank you for introducing this. For those of you interested in this notion of using counterfactuals, though carefully, in history and historical analysis, I wonder how many of you came across, like 15 or 18 years ago, a collection of essays edited by my then Yale history colleague, Jeffrey Parker. And it was called What If? And okay, you can have fun with that. Jeffrey Parker wrote this wonderful essay on what if the Spanish Armada had not been defeated and the great army of Palmer had landed on the Kent shore and advanced upon London. What if the Spanish had actually come in and knocked out Queen Elizabeth's, the Tudor England, etc. What if? So the set of essays that Jeffrey edited and kind of in a way kind of controlled was saying, when can you fairly and sensibly use counterfactuals? And what does it help us in asking about counterfactuals, about why things did not happen? So the what if question leads on to why did it not happen? And therefore, coming into your last point here about the Japanese aircraft carrier and fleet attack into the Indian Ocean in April 1942, with the incredible devastating blows against British bases in Sri Lanka and knocking out some British heavy cruisers and a small aircraft carrier. What if they could have gone further on to the Red Sea, to Aden, and intercepted the British routes into the Middle East that came around Africa? a huge thing for debate, but I think if you gamed it, as I suspect you might have done, you would have said, how could the Japanese have the logistical flow of support to be able to reach that far from Yokohama around via Singapore all the way to the Red Sea? They were not ready to do that, but it was a great fright. And it was a confirmation of the striking power of the Japanese carrier fleets in that first 6 months of the war. So I think we can push on to other counterfactuals as well. The counterfactual, which just doesn't work at all, and by asking it, you get to see it, is like, what if, could Operation Sea Lion, the plan for invading England in the fall of 1940, did it have a chance? And the answer is a double no. The sheer size and sophistication and strength and depth of the Royal Air Force fighter command, radar systems and support systems meant that you weren't going to get control of the air over the United Kingdom itself. And then there was the disproportionate maritime predominance of the Royal Navy, who might have lost some heavy battleships, putting them into the English Channel, but there was no way in which Raiders' dilapidated fleet could have done anything there. Asking the question, could sea lying have been possible, gets you to the answer as to why the Germans were unable to do so little at sea in 1940 and 41 and 42. Thanks for your questions.
Okay, let's go on to Michael. Can you unmute, Michael?
Yes, and actually I have a few questions, but I'll start out, or just keep it on this question of mine. I'll keep it to the one that is has most relevance to what you were just saying. When the Royal Naval victory, and it was, I believe, a victory in the Narvik operations, particularly in the Narvik fjords, and the loss, the basically halving of the German destroyer fleet. I mean, the Germans were obviously, the Kriegsmarine was remiss in having such a small destroyer force to begin with, probably, but that obviously was one of the reasons why Rader was basically saying the Kriegsmarine could not offer even minimal protection for any invasion of England at the time. At least that's what Rader said. But the loss of that, the destruction, particularly to the Kriegsmarine's destroyer force, and the destroyers were quite formidable as destroyers go at that time. What do you think the long-term effect of that? I mean, we know that it obviously, the actions in the Norwegian campaign, particularly at Narvik, seriously diminished the capacity of the Kriegsmarine, the surface fleet. But what do you think the long-term effects were, strategically, long-term effects on the not only the Battle of the Atlantic, but all of the German naval activities, whatever they were, at least up until the launching of the Bismarck, which of course probably did them more harm than good. I was just wondering what your feelings were about the long-lasting effects of the Narvik actions.
As I was listening to you and your interesting question, I was feverishly trying to get through the pages of Victory at Sea to the illustration by Ian Marshall on page 106. I'm wondering if our nifty controllers of the illustrative material here can get to it. It's the painting number 14. Yes, this one. This is quite staggering. By the way, Ian Marshall did about 3 versions of this. This is the one I preferred. We're referring here, folks, to what's called the 2 battles of Narvik in April 1940, in the struggle between the Royal Navy, a bit of a French Navy, and the German Navy to get control of the entrances to the great harbors of Norway, following the rapid German assault upon that country. Here we are with these wonderful maps by my illustrator, attacking 7 different places at once in simultaneous operation. But the painting of that we saw before of the 15-inch gun battleship Warspite being sent by the Admiralty up the Narvik Fjord to finish off the German destroyer flotilla. The Germans had invested quite a lot of their resources before 1939 in trying to get a pretty good heavy fleet destroyer force ready for the conflict. They had committed in this particular battle, in this particular support of the German landing forces, they'd committed no less than 10 fleet destroyers into the Narvik Fjord. They had been, just a couple of days before this, a real pell-mell fight between British destroyer force and German destroyer forces, in which I would say on the whole, each of them comes out pretty much equal. But the fact is it allowed the Royal Navy, feeling stung by the speed of the German offensive and wanting to get their own back, to send, knowing that the German destroyers were up at the far end of the fjord, to send a Warspite into that Norwegian long channel of water, accompanied by a couple of escorting destroyers, and then to find them out and to blow them up. In fact, some of the German destroyer captains voluntarily, opened the plungers and allowed the ships to be sunk in low water. They could take off the crews and join the fight on land. But this did mean that after the campaign for Norway is over, and there was great crisis, political crisis in London at the loss and humiliation inflicted here, in fact, Admiral Raeder could look and say, what is left? What is left of my surface fleet now after these engagements? And not just the destruction of 10 of my 20 prime destroyers, but also other things which happened there too. In naval terms, Norway as battles dealt a really big blow against Admiral Raeder's fleet. And there was little he could do about this in the months and months and months to come.
Thank you. I'll save my next question for when everybody else goes.
Is there any chance we could go back to that map which you just showed up a minute ago?
Your map, rather. Okay,
yes, yeah.
That one.
Yeah, so just for those fellow naval historians who are working on a project right now, on the advice of Yale University Press, I went to this really very, very experienced artist and map maker called Mr. Wilson, who lives on the down close to DC, but on the Maryland shore, and asked him if he could do a set of new maps. We try to look at the maps which are on Roskilde. We tried to look at 4 or 5 other maps, but could he do maps which were hopefully as clear as possible about what is going on? The initial German strokes, the red strokes of all of their successful movements into different parts of Norway, and then the clashes of the actual battles that occur, the sinking of the glowworm, for example, and then the Battle of Narvik. How do you, as an author, talk with a map maker and say, this is what I like to get to the reader, not necessarily a professional reader, in a way to illustrate using your techniques of historical maps? How do you get it? Put the dates in there, if at all possible, show the concatenation of events, and let's see if we can help the reader understand this better. So there's a set of original maps by Wilson, which are meant throughout the book to help us understand this victory at sea. Thank you.
Brandon.
Okay, you got Brandon. You're up.
Dr. Kennedy, I was going to ask a follow-up question on John Prados, who asked you to map, or you did map the naval theoreticians to the theaters. You didn't say anything about the med, so I was curious about that. But you said something which sent a bolt of lightning down my backbone when you brought up Admiral Stavropoulos. You said he's a friend of yours, and I don't think anyone could be better placed that can speak publicly about American strategic naval thought than he is. The other day I saw him on a cable show and he was raising the possibility of forcing the Black Sea to bring out the grain. And I would have thought that was a taboo thing to bring up, but I was wondering to ask as openly as possible how you look at that situation or as a naval proposition.
All right. First of all, your point about the Med and what's happening in the Med and what theories work or what theories prevail. I think anybody looking at the Battle of the Mediterranean between 1940 and 1943 would start once again by looking at geography. How difficult it was for the Royal Navy when France was knocked out, which was not something that had been anticipated by anybody in London. But when France was knocked out, and then when Italy comes in with a very, very large and modern fleet, how on earth are you going to protect that thin line of communications through the Mediterranean? And the answer is with difficulty. You cannot have anything other than small surface vessels operating out of Malta. The Royal Navy submarine flotilla out of Malta works wonderfully, but nothing else could because of the power, the sheer power of German and Italian assaulting aircraft day after day and sometimes night after night. So your lines of communication are chiefly going to go around the Cape and through the Red Sea or onto Indian coast and onto Sydney. But the lines of communication, look at how narrow this all is. How do you move a fleet from Gibraltar slowly along, fairly slowly? Remember, these convoys probably moved at about 9 knots, about 10 miles an hour, agonizingly slow, and all the way to Malta. And what a kind of historical, you might say, historical fluke it was that the British had seized this possession in the Napoleonic War, did not give it up, and could turn it into a fortress, and then later on a base for not only the submarines, but when the air war was more or less won, great air bases too. But how hard it was. When you look at this, you see that the lines of communication story, which Corbett talked about, are quite significant. Some of the Malta convoy battles are staggering in their intensity and ferocity, but it's also the threat all the time of a large Italian surface battle fleet force coming out, which is why the British Admiralty, after middle of 1940, puts that wonderful resource of Force H operating out of Gibraltar to be effective there in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean for the next 2.5 years of the war. It's a story we don't know much about in this country, but it really is worth retelling and defining where this was rather decisive in strategic terms. The significance of Gibraltar in this war was really, really big. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Kennedy. This is about the question of narrative and who dominates the historical narrative, particularly of World War II. And let's look at, say, China. They've got a different perspective, their own very focused one, and we see that in their recent films they've got come out. But India, in particular, has conflicting attitudes. And your accounts of the U-boat war, I was a little bit disappointed in that you didn't elaborate it perhaps a little bit more, because one of the big academic storylines coming out of India is, of course, about the Bengal famine of 43. And the argument that Churchill, again, an iconic figure that people want to dismantle as that. He was making decisions, as you point out in your book, by June of 43, the U-boat losses, thanks to particularly radar, was absolutely critical. But it's not understood by the layman that knowing that and the impact on the U-boat war, Dornier and the rest of it, Dornier, was not understood until late in that year. It was not a given that they'd won that war, the Brits. So decision-making, I think, regarding supplying India or anything regarding India, plus what the Japanese were doing is I think that point is missed, and I would have preferred more emphasis on that, because these narratives right now are very important, because India is saying what's going on in Ukraine has nothing to do with them. They're doing their own thing as far as agricultural, produce. It all relates to each other. And I think that anybody writing history needs to address, I guess, important issues like this in a more concrete way, so that the layman understands what the decision-making was and how important it was in the World War II. If you've got any comment on that.
Yeah, oh, what a great point. And wouldn't it be good if one could think that we might have in the future a number of monographic and perhaps largest studies of coming back to the issue of trade supply in wartime, especially thinking of the British Empire as a whole. Early on in the book, I can't quite now find the page of it, I have that Admiralty map of the scattergraph map of all of the ships at sea in a particular day in November 1937, so just a couple of years before the war. And you can see the significance of the Atlantic trade routes, the trade coming around Freetown in West Africa. You can pick up the significance of the Indian Ocean trades. And then you have to say, well, look at this one. What a beaut. Does anybody know this one? It is one which was put together by the Admiralty for, I think, the London Chamber of Commerce in 1937. It was to show the significance of the need to protect the trade of the British Empire. Look at all of those little dots in and around the Indian Ocean. This includes local, smaller tramp ships, of course. When war comes, that scattergraph is going to be really different out of fear of the U-boats. There's going to have to be more convoy lines, especially in the Atlantic, rather than allowing ships to just go on their own. Right, look at all the little dots in the middle of the Atlantic, North Atlantic and Central Atlantic in 1937. That's not going to be the same in 1942, 43. There's going to be a number of individual sailings, of course, we know that, but a large amount of the traffic flow is going to be hugging the North American coastline, East Coast, all the way up to New York and Newfoundland, and then get convoyed across. Now, the trade of the British Empire, this map is so wonderful, but you need a sort of very sharp eyes or magnifying glass to get in. It's actually showing the sort of trades which are being carried, flax, paper, timber, etc. If you go to the Indian Ocean, you will see what is being transported there. In the midst of trying to protect this worldwide route of trade communication under attack from the U-boats, especially in the Atlantic, in 1943, but also trying to send supplies up to the Middle East and supplies to the British Indian Army in the hope of trying to recover Burma. Not very well done, you might say, in 43, 44. There comes a giant famine in Bengal. And the demands that some of the merchant ships, which are being used for supply for war materials into the Middle Eastern war, be diverted to try to ameliorate those awful effects of the famine. And Churchill, rather robustly, the Indian historians would say arrogantly, refusing to do it. So in the Indian nationalist narrative of the war, Indian nationalist narrative, which in the past few years has become much more nationalist, very few Indian historians pay enough tribute to the incredible role of the British Indian Army in the Middle East and Italy and elsewhere during the war. In the Indian nationalist account of the war, this looks like a selfish action on Churchill's part. Churchill would probably have said, in the grand scheme of grand strategy, we have to defeat those Germans, and we have not sufficient sources to deal with the local famine crisis in Bengal. I leave it up to other historians to come in here on this very important moral issue, what you do in moral judgments in wartime, and see how the later historians in maybe 10 or 15 years' time might have less of a sort of narrow perspective on what is the important thing to be studying here. Thank you. I hope I answered all of your remarks. I couldn't, when you turned me into the Bengal famine part of it, I had to try to show the larger trade backdrop, and I'm grateful that you raised this issue.
Okay. Next is Theodore.
Yes, Ted Cook. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be able to talk to you, Professor Kennedy. I'm very delighted to have a chance to ask you questions about this wonderful new book and all the books that I've been studying for many, many years going back. My field of study is Japan, but I was probably at the very bottom level of the French school. I studied the impact of war on individuals, oral history of Japanese war experience and Japanese leaders. And so while I would love to go off into the what if counterfactual argument, I'm in fact in the middle of teaching a course right now on counterfactuals using Jeremy Black and Neil Ferguson, and going back to Churchill, the articles that Churchill wrote in the 1930s about counterfactuals. And so I'd love to go into that area. But what I was really thinking about is I was at the Naval War College as for 1 year, and as a visiting Naval Secretary of the Navy fellow. And one of the claims that was made at the Naval War College, and I hope I don't lose too many friends when I say this, one of the claims at the Naval War College at the time, this is about the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the war, was that the Naval War College had taught everything except about the Pacific War, had taught everything except the kamikazes. They'd gotten everything else right. Of course, they didn't have the atomic bomb. They claimed they had everything else right. And I was always somewhat questioning that. And so as a Japan historian studying the Japanese war planning and the Japanese thinking, I was prepared to go up and make a lecture, at least one lecture. It's what we got wrong. And of course, with some negative reaction coming to that. But my question for you is, and when one is planning for a war, and this is of course relevant right now to what we look at the war, potential war with China, or potential war with Russia, provoked by trying to run the grain out of Ukraine. I'm not sure how that's going to work out. But when thinking about the war planning, the Japanese Navy built their Navy in the late 30s and mid 30s and late 30s around the American war plan. And if War Plan Orange had gone as originally planned, and as a War Plan Orange, not part of Rainbow, the Japanese pretty much had set the trap for us. We would have sailed right into it. And that was literally our plan, was to sail out and engage them. And they would have been trapped the Japanese would have their long-range bombers, their island bases, their high-level submarine quality force, and all the other things the Navy had built, and the torpedoes from their cruisers would have probably devastated the American fleet coming out of Pearl Harbor. I'm not going to ask you what happens if that had happened, but I am interested in thinking about the issue of war planning. How far back do we have to go back when we think about a plan for war before we start raising the issues that you raised earlier on, I think very effectively? People seem to want to plan a war that happened long ago, and are unwilling to take the things that change the current superiority of a nation's position, or the projected superiority of a position, and eliminate those from the equations for the future. And I'd just like to have you comment a little bit more on that idea of war planning, if you could.
Okay, what a wonderful big area you introduce us to, and I have to start with the remark that I'm just had a month or so ago a smallish conference at Yale with colleagues from the Naval War College, from the Strategy and Policy Department, in which the theme that we had for our two-day conference and the presentation of papers was like, what do navies do, or what do great powers do a year into the war, when the original pre-war planning assumptions have encountered the reality of a different circumstance? What did the British do when France is knocked out of a war in 1940? What do the Americans do when the US battle fleet is knocked out? What do the Japanese do when they don't have the planned rival of the US battle fleet? So a year into the war and what is happening gives us food for thought about our present plans and assumptions. What if our US Navy plans, whatever they are, for taking on China around Taiwan or in the Philippine Sea don't work out? What do you have then? Maybe you need new weapon systems. Maybe you need to come in a different geographic line of offense. So this is a great question to be asked generally about fleet planning. If you can have inside your planning system and inside your planning staff, if you can have somebody who you might call a devil's advocate, somebody who's going to be a burr in the backside, is going to say, well, what if this doesn't work? What if you've got the wrong instrument? What if this plan goes astray? What's your backup plan? And I think that's so important for planners today, as it was important and was oftentimes disregarded by pre-1913 and pre-1939, pre-1941 planners. So if I had been with you in that discussion you had many years ago at the Naval War College, I think I would have been on your side. I don't think that can reasonably be said that the US Navy planners got everything right other than the kamikazes. They had, if I had to give tributes to the US Navy in 1941, 42, it's how they recovered so smartly when their actual war plan had been destroyed, when their battle fleet had been destroyed. What do you do then? How do you reach out via this long line of communications to reinforce Guadalcanal and to get a war going that way, stretching the Japanese out? What do the Japanese planners do, after the early successes? Midway, of course, deals a master blow to them, but even so, they could have come again if the Japanese naval planners had thought there was a way to go. I still remain puzzled and would be interested in your comments here about what I see as a kind of hiatus in Japanese aggressiveness after Midway. Were they really so at the end of their tether that they could only partially reinforce down in the Southwest Pacific at Guadalcanal, so they never made it sufficient enough? Could they not have put together what was still the largest aircraft carrier fleet in the Pacific in late 1942 and done something more damaging? It wasn't just the elimination of Yamamoto later on which is going to cause this. There was a kind of paralysis of the planners and the action makers. What do you make of that?
Well, this is a very interesting question, extremely important, and actually something I'm very concerned about. First of all, I might mention that the Japanese Army wanted nothing to do with operations in Southwest Pacific, and that's critically important because the Army was up to in China. And in fact, they didn't know where Guadalcanal was. The Navy had only captured all that material with naval landing forces, sort of as a refuse in a flashback to after the First World War, when those areas were occupied by the British and became trust territories of the British after the war. So the Army was not interested. The Japanese naval plan for follow-on for Midway was, of course, ultimately was the Eastern Operation, an operation to invade Hawaii. And the Hawaiian plan, which would not have been, assault the beaches at Waikiki, that wasn't what they were planning to do. But they would have isolated, had the Midway battle gone the opposite way, they would have been able to isolate the Hawaii, because there are no planes that could fly there from the continental U.S. So an isolated plans, and then you might have very well have gotten a Japanese strategic attack on the supply lines, attempts to reinforce Hawaii using their long-range submarines, which were very effective. But I think the key point is the Japanese Navy was sort of clueless at that point. They were drawn into that war in the Southwest Pacific, drawn into the Solomons campaign as an extension of what do you do next. And that argument that's been made, and I've heard it from the Australian side many times. I was a Fulbright scholar in Australia for a year at the Australian War Memorial and the Defense University. And when I was down there, again, the issue was always, were the Japanese going to invade Australia? And the conclusion was really they weren't. They had no intention of invading Australia, but they could isolate Australia fairly easily from the east. Not so much on the west. The west was going to bringing everything through Hobart is not. Bringing everything through Perth is not going to be very successful for the Australians. So the idea for I'm not going to go on with a big speech here, but the question you asked for the Japanese High Command, the Navy and the Army, when it clashed with each other, and then the Army never wanted to provide necessary resources to the Navy. Yet when the Army was committed to Guadalcanal and that hopeless battle in Guadalcanal, and then eventually the Bougainville camp, the whole campaign in the Solomons that sapped all that strength out of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese began it with brilliantly, of course, at Savo Island, by sinking the cover force and isolating the Marines. Had the Army been ready, or then even the Navy had been ready to throw even the forces that were available onto the beach right behind the Americans at Guadalcanal that day, well, that would have been a different story. We wouldn't be talking about a Guadalcanal victory. But I think since there was time, and the American Marines, and of course something you emphasize in your book, certainly the Seabees, if the American base building capability was not so good, and the ability to turn the Henderson Field into something extraordinary quickly, the Japanese might very well have failed completely at Guadalcanal. The Americans might have failed at Guadalcanal. One of the most interesting sources I ever located was a diary of a young Japanese worker. He wasn't in the Army, but he was a worker. He might have been Korean, but I don't believe he was Korean. We don't know his name, but I call him, he's the wife of Mariko, the husband of Mariko. And his diary, which he writes to Mariko, was, and within a week after the American landing, they were starving in the jungle. And all the survivors of the Japanese base had been overrun, and they had made no plans for any kind of battle. So that isolation of the forces that were actually involved in building those bases for extending the Japanese reach to the Southwest Pacific further were not prepared for a war. They weren't thinking about that. And so it leaves us with that open-ended question, which is the one you just asked, and I can't close it up. If they don't have a backup plan for the backup plan, what do you do then? And that's really critical in war planning. So that's what I'm very concerned about in watching people in cover the Iraq War. I think in the early days when we landed, and then suddenly they didn't surrender. What do you do now? And the solution was many years of unpleasant conflict. So thank you very much. I'll pass on to the next person. Thank you.
Before we bring Vincent on, because I know Vincent will have something to say about it, John, do you want to chime in on this? John Prados? Just unmute. You have to unmute, John.
Yes, definitely. I would say that the Japanese did have an idea, and that idea was to interrupt the supply line between the United States and Australia, and that priority came ahead of the idea of invading Australia and the idea of invading Hawaii. Ted's preferences to the side. I think the Hawaii plan was a kind of a fantasy in Tokyo, and as far as actual planning in the Imperial Navy was concerned, the thing that they had, the thing that they actually war gamed, the thing that they prepared for and postponed at the time of the Coral Sea battle when they lost it, was the Fiji Samoa operation, which was intended to accomplish that severance of the supply line to Australia.
I'd like to come in with thank you. This is really interesting to me. I have a question for those of you, if any, listening in, looking in, who are more expert than me about the story of the Japanese submarine fleet in the Second World War. They built up a really impressive set of long-range submarines. It seemed to me that they could have used those submarines to interdict that critical line of communications from the American West Coast down to Australia in the way that Dönitz's boats were trying to interdict the long-range routes across the Atlantic. And had they done that instead of using their submarines in such a rather silly, counterproductive way, going hunting for enemy big surface vessels or doing other things in the war, maybe that would have been the turner. And I do think that had they been able to use that submarine fleet better, and secondly, of course, this is the person, in retrospect, knowing that this didn't happen, had the Japanese really worked on long-range logistical supply. After all, they were carrying out the most ambitious geographical expansion of all time, even bigger than Alexander's. And what you needed in this, as the Romans knew so well, was a fantastic investment in long-range supply systems in order to keep, in the Roman case, 34 legions going in different parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. How are you going to keep your supply if you are going to push into the Indian Ocean? If you ever were thinking of taking the northern shores of Australia, if you ever were going down to that Samoa-Fiji strike. So supply. I really do admire, don't know how many people, other people know it, Van Krefeld's wonderful book on supplying war. This is army logistics from its 30 Years' War to Patton. We haven't done a very good naval equivalent of that book on supplying war. There are books on individual books, but naval supplies in wartime would be one I would definitely spend some money in purchasing and reading. Thank you for that comment.
Thank you. Okay, great.
Let me say something before we jump ahead. There are at least two. We both concentrate on the Americans. One is titled Bullets, Beans, and Black Oil, and the other is called Naval Logistics in the Pacific, I think. Both of them focus on the Pacific. Both are World War II, and both are from their American center.
Yes.
But your point about the Japanese submarines, I was just thinking about this the other day, actually, because I'm doing some work on the Japanese naval base at Truk. If the Japanese had blockaded Pearl Harbor with submarines the same way that the Americans essentially blockaded Truk with submarines, the American strategic problem in the Pacific would have been considerably complicated and complexified by that. But the limitations in the Imperial Navy, that's when they begin to apply. Throughout that interwar period, and I forget who it was a little bit earlier in this discussion who referred to War Plan Orange. Throughout that interwar period, the Japanese the Imperial Navy focused and trained that submarine fleet to participate in the so-called decisive battle. And that meant that its application was tactical, and it was for the purpose of attriting the American force going into the big surface battle. And that meant that the Japanese submarine force didn't develop this kind of Corbettian approach.
Yeah.
If I could just
All
add
right,
one.
hold on,
I
Ted.
only just want to finish the one point he just made here. We're talking about the submarines. The Japanese, of course, did develop those long-range special attack type weapons with the carrying airplanes, and they had the operational planning for an attack on the Panama Canal. At some point, there was a possible operation. It was one of the things that Yamamoto had to throw out of the plan because it was too dangerous. The ships might be discovered. But also that was part of their planning. But I completely agree with the statement that was just made that was the strategic, by becoming tactical and supporting the battle fleet, which of course wasn't necessary when the battle fleet on the other side was gone. It changes the whole equation. Thank you. I'm sorry to jump in again.
All right, anyway, let me let Vincent come in here, because Vincent, of course, would have a lot to say about all these issues. Come on, unmute it, Vincent.
Okay, thank you, Jim, and thank you, Dr. Kennedy. Yeah, there's lots of stuff to say about everything, but I want to circle back to technology. Dr. Kennedy was making the point that a lot of new technology is present in naval affairs right now. Nobody really knows how it's going to play out in actual wartime. And I think the important point about technology in World War II is that this was the last peer-to-peer naval war that we've experienced amongst major combatants. There's been nothing since. And I think it's important to remember also that we don't really know how new technology is going to work in combat until combat actually occurs. And there's tons of examples from the 20th century. If you read the expectations for submarines, for example, in 1914, you'll know that the navies went to war expecting that their submarines would be used in one way, ambush, reconnaissance, port protection. But as it turned out, they were useless in all those events, all those missions. And only after combat occurred was the true mission of submarines discovered, and that being the sinking of merchant ships of traffic. So I think when we look at World War II, it's important to remember that a lot of new technologies were introduced there, but more than being introduced, like the airplane, or like the aircraft carrier, they came into their own there under the stress of direct combat. And people have been making a big deal about Ukraine and how Russia and Ukraine is the first time we've seen major warfare between land powers since World War II. Well, I think with naval affairs, the difference, the lapse in between experience and what's going to happen is even greater. I mean, how are drones going to work out in naval affairs, autonomous submarines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And just if you'd like to comment on that, Dr. Kennedy, I'd appreciate it.
Look, this is an achingly important question. And I'm pleased that you point out that we just do not have that experience. This is a very, very long time between the end of the Second World War and the great fleet battles and the great contestations there, and what we might be thinking about the future. I suppose the equivalent in chronological times might be it was an awful long time between the end of the great Nelsonic struggles, of the British Navy against the French and Spanish fleets in 1800 or so, and then the coming of 1914 itself. Which is what caused Henry Ford to say that history was bunk. There was so many new things happening around 1900 that would make history irrelevant or study of it not possible, because the questions were different and the technology was different. If we have to come back to your issue of new technologies today and their potential of being game changers, at least in wars at sea and in the air and in space, I just shake my head. I doff my hat in admiration for anybody who's in naval planning, but I worry a lot that they may have an assumption about a future war and everything has to be over in the first 3 months of the war in the Western Pacific, or even the first week in the war, that may simply be wrong.
It's kind of like Ouija board land. To use an example, radar was demonstrated to the German Navy in 1916, and they saw no practical use for it. And plus, the 6-month development time that was requested was just way too long. They wanted something for the current war. And I believe that a lot of our new technologies that we are pinning such great expectations and hopes on, our naval technologies, how they will function in a war between the Chinese and the Americans, between whoever else goes up next is an open question. We really don't know.
Yep. Scary in a way.
Well, thank you. I'll surrender the floor to Aaron.
Well, Vincent, I'm sure you have another question.
The whole point about the Japanese submarines, for example, and this relates to technology as well, it's all about the mission, isn't it? I mean, the Japanese had a war-winning mission for their submarines. And as far as they were concerned, there was no problems there. Well, it turns out that their war-winning mission was not the war-winning mission that they needed. War against traffic would have been much more logical, as Dr. Kennedy points out. And I think that goes all the way up and down the line. We tend to look at things retrospectively, and we tend to look at things based upon our own geographic and national points of views. And I think that if you take the war as a whole, and mix it up and shake it out and spill it on the floor, you're going to find out that things are a lot different than they look like from Washington or from London. You look at the Italian view of the Mediterranean War, and it's completely different than the standard British narrative. And you can hunt and find those Italian perspectives if you care to, but they're much different than the British. And what's true? Well, I think that we have to blend more. We have to understand that small nations need sea power as well. It's not all about the British, and it's not all about the Americans and the Japanese. Poland had really strong feelings about sea power. I mean, they raised the price to build a submarine by subscription. The people believed in sea power, although they have one port. Romania had concerns with sea power. In World War II, I think it's important to stress that it goes all up and down the food chain. And what's important for Finland is important for Finland, and it's existential, and they have a right to exist. I think it's necessary to consider a lot more than we generally consider when we look at the history of World War II. And I appreciate Dr. Kennedy's approaches to it and the fact that he tries to take a more global and more holistic view of that war. So, and I could go on forever. That's all I'll say.
All right, kind comments. Thank you.
Aaron, unmute.
Thank you, Dr. Kennedy. It's really an honor to speak to you today, and a fantastic career and wonderful books I've read since I was in the Army, even back in 1988, 89. My questions are: there's not much discussion about the development of in the Naval War College in Newport, 10, 12, 13, the long course, and the revolutionary development of sort of red teaming and building, on Vice Admiral Sims, Commodore Knox, Admiral Benson, and just this complete approach, which is to not get locked into a doctrine, but really build competent decision makers, and then more importantly, an application environment for it, which is to create efficiency, especially at the time of battle. And I'm just wondering if you have a perspective on that, especially vis-a-vis the Japanese, who obviously predicated everything on Kantai-Kasan, on the decisive operations. I mean, really, they kind of built a Mahanian, just seek the decisive battle, and everything magical will happen. And it just seems like the U.S. really took an approach that was much more dynamic, and just wanted to have lots of competent decision makers. And you see it in Admiral Nimitz' great book, where they bounced around throughout the whole war, lots of different doctrines, but the competent decision making was pretty consistent. And if you have a perspective on that, that would be great. And once again, it was an honor to to be able to ask you a question.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go indirectly in my reply by giving praises that I think is well due to the new book by Brendan Sims and his co-author on Midway, which has just come out, and everyone probably knows that we're now in the 80th anniversary of the 1942, June 1942 Midway battle. Sims's argument there, when you get to the conclusion, is that it's not just about the great luck of the dive bombers seeing the Japanese aircraft carriers through a hole in the sky and going down. That the United States had built a larger sort of strength in depth Navy and a strength in depth force, going back to leadership, to training, to war colleges, as well as the technology, which came into, of course, good effect in the Battle of Midway. But behind the Battle of Midway were all of these plus factors of the heavy investment in what it takes to be superior in the next war. I would say almost the same is true of what happened in British naval and especially Royal Air Force planning before 1939. Why the Luftwaffe failed was because for the first time they came across an opponent which had such extraordinary strength in depth, especially for defensive air warfare. So your point about the significance of the planning for leadership at the Naval War College in the interwar years, how that was manifest in the sort of naval leaders which were going, like Nimitz, going to come to the fore, along with the recognition by those naval leaders of some of the underpinnings of naval warfare. They were not just, battle alone admirals. They knew something about logistics and communication. Some of them knew a lot about long-range geography as well. I'm struck with the U.S. Navy, even though badly damaged by the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the loss of the battle fleet, had so much more left, strength in depth, to be able to then turn around and begin, almost within a few months of Pearl Harbor, begin to think of how you're going to recover. That you were hit very badly in the head, but you were not knocked out. And that's because you had done a lot of planning about this war and had a lot of resources which were not directly hit by the Japanese. I don't think the Japanese had that strength and depth. One person earlier made the comment that the Japanese army, which was a superior force, was not interested in the war in the Pacific. How on earth were you to assemble the resources necessary to win? Let me stop there. But thanks for your intervention. Thank you so much.
All right, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kennedy. And just as a quick note, I remember seeing you in the late 80s on the Charlie Rose show when you were a younger man promoting the Great Powers Rise and Fall book. And so I've been a fan ever since. My question is, it touches also on the logistics and shipping and in the Mediterranean. One of the things that Alan Brooke emphasizes, particularly in his arguments with the Americans, was that it was necessary to free shipping for Allied shipping in the Mediterranean so they don't have to go around Africa. And then the Americans wanted to go straight into France. I was wondering, post World War II, has there been any study on that specific shipping saved in the Mediterranean to such an extent one could say Alan Brooke was right? I mean, to what extent?
Wow. When I just finished defending my Oxford DPhil dissertation against critical comments of the two professors on the other side of the table in that viva voce exam they have at Oxford, and emerged successfully from that. In other words, I was now Dr. Kennedy. I was asked by a advisor of mine at Oxford if I would consider going on to do a help in a study which might be a recovery of the British official history on logistics and communication and trade in the Second World War. And I nimbly dodged that invitation to spend the next 3 or 4 years of my life doing that because I wanted to do other things, including the Anglo-German antagonism. And I thought that this issue of trade, war, and logistical supplies and merchant shipping in wartime was not very interesting. Oh my, like how wrong I am, or how much I begin to appreciate this, 50 years later. But the key issue for the Anglo-American planners from 1942 onwards was not just the disposition of the American or the British battleships, some American battleships going, to join the home fleet, or what number of surface ships we need for the attack and the torch operation bombardments of North Africa. It's where do you put your grain ships? How many or how few oil tankers do you have of a fast, swift nature? Where do you get your supply lines? Who is, when the new merchant ships are coming out, how many of them are being sent to the Pacific? So relatively speaking, how few might be available in the Atlantic? So merchant shipping at war, an old-fashioned topic, something that the historians of the Napoleonic War would reprove you by not having a full understanding of, is something we're still way back in understanding. How could you think of a vast invasion of France in 1942 when A, you hadn't won the war in the air, and B, you just didn't have enough logistical supply, and C, the British, Churchill and Allenbrook had, of course, pushed a large number of those supply ships into the engagement against Italy rather than against Germany. All of this needs better understanding by us. Thanks for that intervention.
All right. Let me bring in everybody else as a grand question so we can end more or less on time. And we thank you so much, Professor Kennedy, for being so generous with your time on a Saturday morning on the shore of Connecticut to share with us your opinions about this. Michael, first pose your question. I'm going to then take them in rapid succession. Then Aaron will make his final comments and we'll close out. Go on, Michael.
All right. Well, actually, I was going to, in addition, make 2 points that might answer. Well, I'll make one of them as far as answering your question about why Japanese submarines didn't do much. And I know this is often dismissed, but the idea of the code of honor, so to speak. But I know that when the actor Ron Randell told me that when he finished his service in the Australian Army, he was in late 1943, he decided to go to move to Hollywood, and he took a merchant ship from Australia to the west coast of the United States. While he was there, he saw a torpedo cross their bow, and of course, all the alarms went off. And then they got a message in the clear, in English, from the Japanese submarine that had launched it, apologizing and saying they had mistaken them for a warship. Since they were a merchant ship, they apologized for firing the torpedo and broke off the attack.
Wow.
So I don't know if that little example, but I mean, I think that code of honor, the whole Bushido code thing, did interdict in some way into their thinking. That, I don't know if that helps you at all. But as far as my question, I have to go back to the what I would consider. What I would consider the nail in the coffin for the German surface fleet, which was the sinking of the Bismarck. After the Bismarck was sunk, it seemed that the dictum for the Kriegsmarine for the surface fleet used to be, seemed to be after that, just don't get sunk. They, except for the Scharnhorst foray, they really rarely did any offensive operations. But my question about that has to do with the KG-5 class of battleships. When in the sinking of the Bismarck, King George V, along with the Rodney, Rodney had 16-inch guns, and the King George V had 14-inch guns. But since the King George V class of battleship was basically built under the Washington treaties, under the treaties that were there, and therefore there were more limitations. However, the ships, would you say that forced the Royal Navy to think outside of the box? Because there are many people, I have to say myself included, who thought that HMS King George V might have been able to take on the Bismarck alone, even with the Bismarck having a sustainable rudder. So, I mean, but did that, I mean, and HMS King George V acquitted itself very well right up to the end of the war when it was British Pacific Fleet. But did the development of the KG-5 class, the KG-5 itself, and the Prince of Wales, which we know what happened to her, and the Duke of York, etc., and the Nelson class, did that force them to actually make those ships better in other ways? That, for instance, the Kriegsmarine, which seemed to still be focused on brute force, but did that development of these vessels, because of the treaty, actually advance the technology of Royal Navy warships?
So you don't talk about it too much directly, but of course, you know, with the Second World War, the issue of code breaking always is a major one. And, you know, with various people, you know, asserting more or less importance to it, or again, with the case of Ultra, saying basically, with Ultra, that alone won the war, essentially. And then, you know, of course, and you mentioned it, you know, German and Italian and even Japanese code breaking of naval codes gave them a lot of advantages in certain periods. So, yes, I just wonder if you could talk about how much importance you give to code breaking in the naval war. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, then Frank.
Okay, well, this is flipping everything on its head. In regards to who won the war and what won the war for them, you can argue in Mackinder style that the Soviet Union won the war.
Yep.
And they didn't use a navy. Somebody else did. And from a geostrategic point of view, looking at the present, it is the heartland. And if you couple that with zircons and all the type of new kind of weapon systems that are out there, you know, it's quite possible to argue that spending an awful lot of money on a navy may not be as important as, say, the equivalent of Comintern. All right. And we need to get it right, and we need to focus, because the other side may get very slick. Because if you dominate the heartland, you don't really need a navy. So that's just posing that kind of awkward question.
I apologize if I'm going to be running away in a few minutes' time. I do have later Saturday afternoon dates and engagements here, so I can't really get through much of all of the various comments. I would say there's a number of things I just wish to suggest more work need be done. Isn't that typical of what historians do when they're at the end of a discussion? I propose, say, the British battleship type, the KGVs, the King George V. My understanding is that if you had a naval architect here looking at the KGVs versus the Bismarck, you'd be actually quite surprised by the superior armor protection that was built into those ships. The British warships were not very fast. Even the KGV's fast battleships were not as fast, but they were pretty well built. And I think the 14-inch guns would have done a lot of damage, but having 4 guns in a turret had its own technical problems there. And it's therefore useful that the Rodney came along in time to keep bashing in the Bismarck with 16-inch shells. code breaking in wartime, I'm really interested in what other scholars think. Obviously, not in today's discussion. I had a feeling that there was at least in the Pacific War, I think the American advantage in code breaking, both of the naval codes and the diplomatic codes, was very, very decisive. In the battle against Germany and the B-Dienst, I think it was back and forward. And the Germans were reading a lot of British convoy intelligence and using their submarine disposals in a very good way there. And at the end of the day, even when your code breaking has brought the two vessels together or has brought the U-boats close to the convoy, it has to be fought by weapons systems, by radar, by submarines on the other hand, by small surface warships against submarines, and by leadership and sheer guts in the battle. As to who won the Second World War, what a great debate this one is. It's a gigantic one. I was brought up in a tradition taught to me by, say, John Ericsson, the Scottish historian of the Red Army, that the Red Army decisively won the Second World War because 85% of Wehrmacht casualties were on the Eastern Front. Then along comes Payson O'Brien with his book, which says air and sea warfare was much, much more decisive and took much, much more of the Allied resources in hand. That's for a future debate, I think. In all, I have enjoyed the various questions you've thrown at me, the different parts of a debate. This is a very large, massive thing, the naval war at sea, the underpinning technologies, the overall geostrategic theories, and how they pan out in the war. I'm really grateful to our organizers, Jim, for putting this together. Thank you for that.
And I just wanted to have Aaron have the last word here. Go on, Aaron. And of course, we had the great paintings of Ian Marshall. Go on, Aaron.
No, well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Paul, so much for your generosity with your time. I know you have to run, so I just thought I'd leave it kind of thinking toward the future of some things that we didn't get to cover. Both of which seem relevant to the future of naval warfare and somewhat pertinent to China, which is outer space and also the climate change and relatedly the construction of islands, all of which are things that China is to varying degrees involved with. And so, yeah, we can all look ahead to 50 years when when we're writing the history of this period and looking back at what decisive technologies were developed and used now. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Paul, for being so kind to spend time with us today. Thank you, Aaron Glasserman, for coming in. I know, Paul, we could have kept you on for at least another 7 or 8 hours.
Yeah.
So
and I would have missed not only my tea date, but my dinner date.
Oh, yes, but we don't want you to do that. And then, of course, we want to thank Ken Aaron for all the work he does in engineering us, John Prados, everybody else for joining us today. The book we're talking about is Victory at Sea, which has just come out. Yale University Press has published it, and it's a great contribution to the line of all the great works that you've done.
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Salute.